Welcome to the Carey Nieuwhof Leadership Podcast on YouTube. My name is Carey Nieuwhof, and my goal is to help you lead like never before. So what I do every week is I sit down with world-class leaders and church leaders, business leaders, and I talk to them about what made them who they are and try to have the conversation with them that you would have if you got to sit down for lunch with them or have dinner with them or really got to spend some time with them. So we go into the backstory and we explore what made them who they are and some of the principles they've learned along the way. So if you enjoy this episode, I would love for you to like it, to subscribe, and also to share it with your friends. And in the meantime, here's today's episode. Steve, I have been looking forward to this conversation for a long time. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Carey. I just absolutely love you and the stuff that you put out. I just got to tell you, you are an absolute gift to the kingdom. So it's an honor to be with you, my friend.
Well, I appreciate it. I feel the same way about you. So I want to start here. I think we probably should start here. So 3 years ago, you were positioned to be one of the successors, the key teaching pastor at Willow Creek, Chicago. Then everything changed as the allegations of long-term sexual abuse and harassment by the senior pastor, Bill Hybels, surfaced, precipitating a crisis for everybody involved, and for the victims and just the sadness that created. So many things happened at once. What was it like to go through that as a leader?
Yeah,
I know it's such a simple question. It's so loaded, but man, you were there in the middle of it.
Well, okay, so this is fascinating because on multiple levels. First off, 3 years ago, you released a book about a month after I resigned, and it was called "Didn't See It Coming." Which,
yeah, you're right.
So I am somewhere after I've left Willow, and I run into your agent, and
Esther.
She's Esther, and she's fantastic. She comes up to me and she goes, "Steve, I can't imagine what you're going through. Carey's got a book coming out in 2 weeks. You've got to read it." And I'll just be honest, that book, and again, this season, God surprised me with a lot of different voices. And that book, though, I think encapsulated a lot. The feeling of, I didn't see this coming. I did not.
You didn't know. You were sitting on a scandal.
Right.
No.
And so this in so many ways, this was my dream job. I mean, this was the story of Dr. B pouring into Bill, and then Bill going to pour into me. And I had already, and I think any leader, whether in the marketplace, whether, as a pastor, you can have these moments where you get out ahead and you start playing it out. Well, someday I'm going to be able to be a Dr. B for somebody else. And I had just bought in. I bought into the values. I fell in love with the congregation. I loved Chicago. And then you don't see something coming that ends up being an earthquake I just culturally within the kingdom, the layers to all of it. You had women who were being so brave and honest and human. You had just decision making that was just wrong. You had self-preservation. I mean, you're an organization that's almost 1/3 of $1 billion in assets, and self-preservation's kicking in. And I'm in the middle of this trying to figure out, number one, they don't prepare you for this in seminary. Yeah. They don't go, hey, when a big massive crisis comes and there's people on Twitter and this is what you do. So you're learning, and I am trying to make sense of, what do I do? There's no win. And I'm a 3 on the Enneagram. And I felt like any decision I make, I was going to hurt people, which for me was forced a level of, what are the most important values? What are the most important principles? And that's where, words like character, which you, again, talk about and didn't see it coming, integrity, just start rising. and I think really going, what's the right thing? And what I saw with these women, as I started to hear their stories from them personally, I realized we've got to make some decisions. So it was a mixture. It was a bad cocktail of emotions, of sadness, um, just anger at moments, feeling betrayed, trying to put myself in the position of women who were coming forward, and for them not to feel seen or heard or their allegations taken seriously, just all of that, and having the responsibility to go, I have to represent Christ. And how do I shepherd people through this as a pastor of a congregation I absolutely love? And you just get into this reality of, I've never been paid more. I've never spoken to a larger room. I've never had more influence. I've never had more. All of my dream job and achiever dreams had been made. But if I'm just going to play church, if I'm going to play a role, if I'm going to go against these women's story, what am I doing? It's not what I set out to get into this calling for. It was to represent Christ well. And I just felt like we weren't doing a good job. And it wasn't the Willow that I knew. The Willow I knew was like one that actually would be able to do that and have the honest conversation. And that's what I had been hoping for. But in some organizations, at certain times, I think there were a lot of people were trying to make sense of this, and self-preservation and organizational protection, I think, began to creep in almost and become more important than the mission.
Yeah, it's almost like talking to you. And again, this is not a complete exegesis of what happened at Willow, and that's not the purpose. That is much beyond the purview of this conversation, but it was just tragic at every level.
Every level.
Felt for the women. And, you keep thinking, well, maybe this was one incident, and then you realize, oh, this appears to be a serial pattern over many decades. And it's just, it was sickening and just heartbreaking on every level, for the women, for people who put their faith in a leader, for, I don't know. Words are still difficult to wrap around that.
Yeah.
And you're in the middle of that.
Yeah. And I think partly recognizing too is, I didn't do everything right. I mean, that's, I had to come back and actually recognize, like, oh man, like there were parts of me that didn't want to believe. There were parts of me that wanted to protect. There were parts of me that, and I think having to begin to be really honest and really human about those parts in me. And I think what ends up happening is you start to find stuff out that have been kind of buried or kept for many years or decades. And every leader knows this, but the violation of trust is one of the single most hardest things to restore and rebuild. And especially in the midst of a crisis, when you don't know, who can I trust? Who's going to tell me the truth? And I think that piece, I think for everyone in the midst of it, you are having to wrestle with, what is the truth? Who can I trust? And what is the next best right step forward?
That's a really interesting point. I hadn't thought about that, but I'm sure from the outside looking in, it's very easy to analyze and think you've got this figured out. But I'm sure when you're in the middle of that, you're like, wait, I've trusted the board. I've trusted Bill. I've trusted these people that must have been deeply confusing. You hinted at something. You said, I didn't do everything right. You got a couple years distance now. Looking back on it, is there anything you wish you had done differently?
Yeah, I that's a great question. I think there's a handful. Right from the jump I remember the Thursday night when the Tribune article dropped, and the executive team, Hybels family is just basically reading that article. And it was a long article. I mean, I think it was the longest article I'd ever read, like in a paper. And it's like almost 7,000 words. And the next day we ended up having a family meeting. And I wasn't supposed to
By
be
family,
on stage.
you meant church or?
Yeah, it was kind of like the church congregation meeting to talk about the allegations. And I wasn't supposed to be on that stage. And that day, that Friday, a couple of people just came out to me and said, hey, and Bill being one of them, going, hey, would you be on the stage? It would mean a lot to me. And part of it, I was like, I don't really know all these stories. But I cared for him. I cared for our congregation, and I had trust with the congregation. I should not have been on that stage. And I had a check in my spirit going, I don't think this is the wisest thing. But being on there, I wasn't aware enough of what that would communicate, one, to the women, and then two, you know what it's like when you're on stage with multiple people. Sometimes you will see the energy level being different. So you use humor, or you try and kind of try to ask a question to try and bring people down, so that it's the right tone, it's the right spirit. And so much of this was like boomer sensibilities versus millennial sensibilities. And I was going, this is not working. This is not going to work. This is not going to play well on social media. And I made a couple of jokes that I had to go to the women a month and a half later, and apologize for. And I just tried to minimize. What I say is, I tried to bring the energy back down and the tone back down in those family meetings. But by making a joke, I minimized what the women were experiencing. I wish I didn't do that.
The story, the credibility,
the credibility, and that's on me. And then two, I think the trust piece, I didn't know who I could trust. And so
huge lesson in that.
Yeah. And one of the things I ended up doing, because I didn't feel like I was getting the whole story, is I went rogue. And meaning I ended up going to reach out to each of the women to basically say, hey, there's no reason for you to trust me. But would you tell me your story? Because I don't feel like I'm getting it all. And these women courageously did that 2-3 months in. That really helped me see how long they had been carrying this, what they had been walking through, what they had endured, which caused me to then have to respond. But because I lacked the trust of certain people, I went rogue. And so I wish I would have, and I don't know if I could have done it differently, because when you have a breakdown of trust, but I wish I would have trusted a couple of more people who now I know were probably closer in alignment with me. But in that moment, I didn't know. And I just needed to get to the bottom of the truth. I mean, I had turned my basement into it looked like the set of Scandal, the show, with the pictures. And I was trying to figure out all these stories, because many of the women I had never actually met. I knew of their names, but I didn't know them. And so I didn't have personal relationships with them. So part of it was I got to figure this out. What is actually true? And who can I trust? And again, what's the next best right step forward?
So you think it was a mistake to talk to the women, or you wish you'd talked to them sooner, or what?
No, I not that I think it's a mistake. I think it was a piece that I went at it alone. And because I wish I could have, I wish I would have trusted 2 elders in particular. I think they were closer in alignment, that I could say, hey, you need to trust me, but I got to get to the bottom of this. I had just was getting these rumblings, and I felt like, for a few months, every day I was learning something new, a new fact or a new allegation or a new story or a new conversation or a new way something had been interpreted. And I was going, why is this happening? And here's, again, another worst spot for any young leader to ever be in, is when you have all the influence, but with no actual authority.
Yeah, because you were how old in 2018? Steve?
I was 38. And so I had, Bill stepped down. I had the influence of the congregation there. We loved each other. There was something beautiful there, but I wasn't an elder. I did not have authority for this is what needs to happen. So all the influence, and people had probably believed I had more authority than I did. But I think that that was a hard piece for me to navigate as well. Having all of that influence and trust from the congregation to do the right thing, but not the decision-making power to see it all the way forward. So I just wish today, if I could go back, I could have found just some space in me to go, I'm going to trust you, and it might not work for me, but I need you to know I'm going to speak to these women. And I think I wish I would have not been on that stage. Those are two easy ones for me that I look back and go, I wish I would have done that differently.
So is it kind of like speak less, listen more in a situation like that? Is it that, or is it different than that?
Well, I think in this culture today, it's a little bit guilt by association, but
Right.
I think more than that, by being on that stage, I represented that I was in solidarity to what was coming out of the mouths of other people.
Right.
And I think not knowing the full story, if I had known the full story and I was in full backing, then I should be on the stage. But not knowing the full story, what it did was I felt like it was using my trust chips to almost go out to the congregation and go, see, look at all of these people are in alignment, so you can trust us. When there were parts
when you
where
didn't have an independent ability to verify
100%.
that, which you then got later, but by that time,
damage was done.
Those moments had
Yes.
happened. One of the things, and for the record, I wrote, didn't see it coming. The manuscript was turned in long before the Willow scandal broke. But you're right. I was very concerned about the moral failure I had seen in leaders. I was concerned about burnout, cynicism, pride, all those things in leadership that honestly, I think at some level we all have to battle.
Yes.
And there isn't a section on affairs or abuse, but there is, a section on cynicism and irrelevance and emptiness, which I think leaders bring. I would love to get your mind, because it's not just Willow. Sadly, these stories keep coming. They keep surfacing. I feel sick as I ask this question, because you always think, okay, it's going to be over, right? And then it's not over. There's more. And it's all kinds of denominations, all kinds of leadership. What is it in your mind about why moral failings by leaders, pastors and leaders, is such an epidemic these days?
Man, I think that's something I've wrestled with myself, just trying to make sense of, because there was a run the past year where it felt like every month a spiritual giant, somebody new, and I don't think anybody just wakes up one day and goes, you know what today I want to do, Carey? I want to train wreck my life. I want to sabotage every relationship, every ounce of integrity, every gift that's been entrusted to me. I just want to do that. I don't think it happens, but it really, I feel like, seems to happen slowly but surely. And, Dave Chappelle, the comedian, he signs a $50 million contract with Comedy Central. Episode 5, he tells a joke and the room erupts in laughter. And he doesn't think the laughter is worth the actual delivery of his joke. He thinks it's off. And he has a moment where he's like, all they see is dollar signs. And he walks off the set, calls his driver says, I'll be there in 2 minutes. Walks out. Driver goes, where do you want to go? Take me to the airport. On the way to the airport, he's looking for flights, gets there, American, Delta, wherever. He goes, take me to the farthest place. They find out that you can go to South Africa. He goes to South Africa in 3 hours, hasn't told anybody. He goes to a monastery. He stays there for a month. And then 6 months later, like every celebrity who's trying to, return, he finds himself on a couch with Oprah. And I don't know how Oprah does this, man. She looks into his eyes. He starts to cry. And she just looks at him and goes, why do you do it? Why'd you do it, Dave? Why? And he says this line, I'll never forget it. He says, because sometimes success can take you places that character cannot sustain you. And I come back to that. You hit it again. I feel like I could plug Didn't See Coming like again and again, but you talk about character development.
Yeah, I got a whole section on character.
And we push competency again and again over the development of our character. And I think what ends up happening with a lot of these young leaders, and again in the mega church world, is you have people who are vying for your attention. You have book deals, you have conferences, you have side hustles with other organizations that you've started, you've got speaking, you've got the pressures of leading a church. And again, this world just gets bigger and bigger and bigger than what your character can sustain. And so the natural response is take a shortcut. And the natural response is nobody understands how hard it is, and nobody gets what you're doing. You're the only one who cares about this. And slowly but surely, you will look for a release. It's just human nature. You are going to look for a place to put that sadness, a place to escape. And it can be in food.
It doesn't have to be sex.
Right. It can be in money. It can be in more power. But again, it is a addiction that often takes people into places. And then I think some guys actually want out and they don't know how to actually do it well. And it's easier for them to blow it all up.
I had that conversation. I think I'd tell the story and didn't see it coming, very anonymized. But when I was a young leader up here, I've been in the same place for over 25 years. Same people, same community, same bride, all that stuff, which is awesome. After a while, it just becomes awesome, right?
Yeah.
That you're doing decades-long relationships with these people. But I remember as a young leader, our church had started to grow. But the big church was in a town nearby, and it came out that the pastor had an affair with his assistant. Ended up in the back row of our church, and I took him out for lunch one day, and I just said, "Why'd you do it?" And he said the pressure of, and it wasn't like thousands, it was hundreds, but the pressure was so great. He said, "I just didn't know what to do, and this was easier. It was easier to step back because I did something immoral than to say, I don't know how to lead this thing anymore." I've never forgotten that. That was over 20 years ago. And I'm like, wow. And that put in me, you think about it, you're right. Platform has its challenges. I have a moderate sized platform, and it's not huge, not household names, but I'm so thankful I didn't have that in my 30s because I don't know what would have happened.
Right.
I just had my hand to the plow trying to figure out every day, right? And working with the people in my immediate site rather than, a larger ministry. But man, it's hard. And I get those pitfalls. Do you think governance has been part of the Willow story, but not just Willow, many other churches. Do you think governance can stop that? Like better governance, different governance? Or do you think it's like a personal thing? Like, can you just cheat any system you happen to be in? Like, it's a question I ask.
I think so. I think you can cheat. You can cheat anything. I think you can, I think unless you are walking in a level of humility that you have given permission and you are so clear, hey, I have this propensity to make this about me or to create the easiest pathway or to put people who are just yes people on my board. Like, unless you're able to really kind of interrogate the decisions you make, I think you can gamify anything. You can make anything work for you, and even the system. The system at which, for me, one of the breakdowns in the governance model was, and I love the Carver model. That's what Willow was doing, and I had done and been a part of that in a couple of other organizations. But the way that it was interpreted is different from the other places that I had been. And what I mean by that was the CEO would talk to the staff and the CEO would only talk to the CGO, and that would be the board chair. And the CGO then would only talk to the other elders or the other board members. So what it did was it created a one-on-one dynamic, which that I think loses the essence of robust dialogue. It loses the essence. So I think then that puts it who has the more power in a one-on-one conversation. And it plays to one person's strengths over another. So I think what we have to do is really take into account our shadow sides. We have to take into account our natural giftings and go, how do we almost create a board that protects us from ourselves and protects the mission and the vision and the beauty of what is trying to be accomplished, whether in a local church or in the marketplace or another great NGO.
Yeah, I'm not saying there are better or worse forms of government. Clearly, there are terrible forms of government and great forms of government, but I would probably be with you on that. Like, unless you're really, and I think the key word in what you said for me is humility. Like, if you're willing to submit yourself to someone else, because it can look great on paper, but you can basically set something up where everybody serves you. And, as Andy Stanley said many times, unless you're in the kingdom of God, power flows up. All the benefits flow to the person at the top. In the kingdom of God, that gets reversed. But yeah, you use your power to serve others, and you're accountable. And that's a very different reality. Any other thoughts on why like you kind of get into it? We're going to talk about your book, The Thing Beneath the Thing. So maybe we can save it for that. But this is part of the reason I wrote Didn't See It Coming and do some of the other work I do is I'm concerned. And, I'm seeing a counselor right now to make sure that I finish well, right? Like, I don't want to blow it. Like, I don't want to end up there. How do you end up there? Right. And I think when you think you can't, maybe you do. I don't know. Trying to figure that out.
Well, what's funny is going into this interview, I just went back through some of my journals, and after I read a book, I usually will just kind of quotes for notes is what I'll do. And I wrote down 11 back in, I think, September 15th of 2018 after I had read your book. But you had one quote in there, no matter how hard you try, you can't escape you. And I think often
I've been trying for many years, singularly unsuccessful.
Right, me too, and I think we try, whether in performance, we try in so many places to escape the pain points of our life. And we actually think the more good that we do, will give us a free pass, or we don't have to like address. And you talk about this, you can't address what you don't are unwilling to confess. Like, I think the level of humility that is required to finish well is being able to not just say I was wrong when we say yes to Jesus, but to live a life that can be clearly, I was wrong in that meeting. I was wrong with how I quoted that and didn't give actual name recognition to that idea. I was wrong. Like, I think leaders have to be quicker to saying that they were wrong. And if they're not, then that power flowing up, like you mentioned with Andy Stanley, we will find ourselves justifying. You talk about this again. I feel like we should just make this about Didn't See It Coming, because everyone needs to read that book. It's such a great book. But literally, you will start to justify your actions.
Yeah.
You'll
excuse it. You won't explain it. You'll excuse it and justify it.
Exactly. And when you start moving that, it's only a matter of time until you don't finish well.
I hear you on that. And, one of the things that I'm encouraged, a lot of young leaders listening, I think I see more humility in millennials and in Gen Z than perhaps I see in older Xers and boomers. And that's a broad categorization, but the ability to say, yep, I'm still struggling, the ability to say, I make mistakes, the ability not to defend and try to preserve is really hard if you've had any modicum of success along the way. And I remember a conversation we had, maybe correct me on the time frame, maybe a month after you resigned from Willow. And I think you were literally in the desert. If I remember where I was in my driveway when I took that phone call, and we talked for a while. A month or two later, what emotions are you unpacking as, your dream job, which you thought you had in succession, appeared to be going well until this sick underbelly got revealed of what was really going on. And, now you got a whole new life, whole new future. You're still reeling. What's going on inside you, Steve?
Yeah. I'd go to a local Starbucks. We live 2 minutes from Willow, 3 minutes from Willow. And, I think for a lot of people in that congregation, they didn't know the actual story. So that all they had was just news reports. And this was a place where there's sweat equity. There was people who had given
They've invested for decades.
You know what I mean? So this just didn't make sense. There was so much. And I think what was so tricky was people were so pot committed to the idea of this church. They had such pride in their church. And this was just hard because this dealt with people that they loved, they respected. And I remember waking up in the middle of the night and I felt like God said, go to the desert and wait for instructions. And I like, it hit me. And I got up, grabbed my journal. I started to write more. Like, what does it mean? Like, I'm thinking metaphorically.
Yeah, not a lot of deserts near Chicago. So.
Right. So I just start writing, and I feel like I write this phrase: you can't achieve your way out of this. You can only grieve your way through it. And I had all the muscle in the world to achieve. I mean, I was a guy who created goals. You know, I'm a 5'11" guy with no jump shot. I had a goal to play Division I basketball. Play is probably not the right word because I sat the bench, but I got free shoes and I played Division I basketball. Like I was a guy who had goals and went after it. I had no muscle when it came to grieving and to sitting in my sadness. And so that next morning, my wife wakes up and I tell her, hey, this is what I felt like I heard. And she teared up and she said, Steve, I've been sensing the same thing. I just want to go home. And she was from Arizona. And I realized, oh, this is literal. We are going to the desert. Wow. And so I ended up buying as many books about the desert fathers and desert mothers. And just because like Eugene Peterson will teach us, you know, your geography is so connected to your understanding of theology and how the desert had really shaped some of these first Christians. And desert comes from the idea of the deserted place. And I felt like in many ways, that sense of the dreams I had were deserted. And the desert became this great untangling for what I thought was true, what that wasn't, what I believed to be false, but was actually true. I mean, it untangled stuff about my identity. It untangled stuff about how I viewed my gifting, my worth. It got me to the core. And the crazy piece about the desert, and you read Deuteronomy 8, you see the gift that the desert is you realize we are desert people. That there is a stripping away, there is a reshaping of the heart. And every leader, doesn't matter if you're in the marketplace, it doesn't matter if you're in a church, you will go through these desert seasons. And I realize if I can't do the desert well, I'll never be able to do the promised land well. And for many of us leaders, we're trying to bypass the desert, bypass the wrestling, the stripping away, the confessing, the grieving, and the recognizing how we've just kind of drifted. And I think for me, the desert has saved me. Like I would not have chosen it, and I'm so grateful it chose me. Because it has taught me so much and allowed my roots to go so much deeper than any stage could have ever done.
I think John Mark Comer says we often romanticize the desert, but he says it's actually our spiritual fathers and mothers. No, that was a place of torture. That is the dark night of the soul. That is the ripping apart. I'm not going to make it. And what were one or two lessons that kind of God seared on your heart during your desert time?
Yeah. You know, I think one of the easiest for me was realizing, you know, we kind of live in this time right now with simple tweetable phrases, you know, God is with me. And we love that. It's fantastic. Or, and then it goes through a struggle, and it's almost this kind of 3-stage discipleship formation. We go through this like simple statement that then ends up going through this struggle. And we wonder, like, is God really with me here in that dark night of the soul? Is God really with me in this deserted place? And then all of a sudden you recognize he is, and he starts to surprise you. And now that simple phrase has gone through the fire and the struggle, and it becomes something profoundly sacred. And I realized some of these statements, these theological realities that I had believed, but they had been removed from struggle. And then as they went through the struggle, they have a level of meaning and depth to them that I go, gosh, like this is what is preparing me for what God has next. I think secondly is when you're in the desert, you have to focus on what you can control. There's a lot you can't control. And I think being able to control, okay, this is what I need to bring for this hike up Camelback Mountain or this trek. This is what I can control. The more that I began to become so familiar with, I can't control with what they're saying, what they're tweeting, what they're thinking, what people are messaging me. I can't control the next phase of what outcome at Willow, or I can't control. Here's what I can control. And let's just focus in on that. And let's work towards that. And I felt like for me, I stopped looking in other people's yards and I was able to focus in what God had entrusted to me and start to create, in my opinion, some beautiful things. And that's been a real gift that I think before my head was probably way too much on a swivel, wondering, what are they saying? What are they thinking? What's this? What's this? And I think it's hard to keep the remaining and abiding in Christ when your head's constantly on a swivel.
Yeah, a couple of thoughts. It's exactly what Tim Keller said in a recent interview that I had the privilege of doing with him, that, when he was rethinking suffering in light of his cancer diagnosis and treatment, he didn't like have new beliefs, but he went over the beliefs he had had for all of his life. And he's like, I wrote a book on suffering, but then all of a sudden it meant something. I'm like,
Yes.
these were intellectual truths, but he goes, now all of a sudden it gripped me in a way it hadn't. One thing that, might be, we can move on if it's not helpful, but I just thought about it and what you said, like people are probably writing all kinds of things about you and your role on the internet and hitting you up for comments. And every time you look at your phone, there's dozens of new DMs. What did you learn about responding or not responding or how to respond? Or I don't remember you being particularly active in those few months after. Was it better just to sort of get your own soul in shape, or like what advice would you have for leaders? And I'm not interested in a spin angle or anything like that. That's not where I'm going. I'm just like, how do you as a human deal with that kind of unnatural attention for a situation that arguably you didn't even know existed?
Yeah, I think that's the hard part, is all of this will bring to light your unchecked motivations. And as a 3, image management is there. Protecting how people perceive you. Right. You can say that you're not the hero, but somehow you can slowly but surely over time create narratives and stories where that 3s tend to do this. And I think I had to be really, really aware. Who were the heroes? The brave women, the women who did the right thing. Why did I do what I did? Simply because I had a value of integrity. And 2, I thought it should be handled differently. And 3, I just wanted to actually support what I felt like the women were bravely doing. So I tend to live my life with, if I don't understand it, how do I put it into a basketball play? Because I understand basketball. Or how do I put it into a framework? Because a healthy framework will make my life work. And I think as all of this was coming at me, I had to make some values. You're not the hero. So do not post anything. You might want to, but make sure you reread that. And who's the hero in this story? It's not you. It was the women. It was the women. Hey, what in you is trying to take revenge? What in you is trying to, because people are saying negative things about you, to try and deflect it? You've, and I'm not saying I always did that well, but man, I had to internalize and find healthy outlets to channel it. I think this is like the power of the Psalms, because you read the Psalms and they are graphic. David going, man, I am so angry at my enemies. God, I wish you would just like crush their heads, with a big rock. Blessed be the name of the Lord,
Yeah.
But I think what David knew was, I don't need to put that on Twitter. I need to give that to you. And I think for me, it was what is the healthy response that's going to help the cause of the women? And then what is the unhealthy response that's going to help the cause of Steve? And hey, if that's unhealthy, I have someone I can bring that to. One that is free, that's God, and one that costs money, and that's my counselor. And I can do that. And so I looked for, I think, helpful and healthy responses. Again, I didn't always do that right, but I'm trying to step back and go, when crisis comes, you have to change adversity into an opportunity. And it will be an opportunity for your brokenness to be more exposed, your fear to be more exposed, or it'll be an opportunity for you to demonstrate the kind of person that you want to be and the kind of person that you truly are. But that's where the character formation and the desert and the trusting is truly showcased and exposed.
So your new podcast, Crafting Character, which I'm a subscriber of, really enjoy it. I love how it's the craft of preaching, the craft of sermon writing, but also about character. So you've embraced podcasting, which I'm really excited about. You got a book, which we'll talk about. How did you decide what the next chapter held?
Man, Carey, I was spinning. I mean, I knew church leadership. I knew church world. You tell me the day of the week and the time of the day, I could tell you what I was doing. My structure breeded freedom for me. And now I'm my own CEO, and I don't have anybody else telling me what to do. I don't have any structure. And I kind of was like swirling a little bit. And I have some friends over at the Patterson Center, and a buddy of mine, Neil, does a life plan. And he said, hey, let's do a life plan. It's 48 hours. You run through your life. You come out with a calling statement. And I ended up coming up with 4 buckets. And the buckets simply were preaching, coaching, writing, and sports, because I just love sports. And then the question became, okay, well, how are you going to actually monetize this? Well, how are you going to give yourself to this?
Got to eat at some point.
Exactly, right? And so I think what it ended up helping me was, again, what can I control? This is what I'd love to do. This is what I would do wherever I was. Now, how do we take steps to do that and build a schedule and build a life that actually works? And who are some models of this? And I started reaching out and getting some real great coaching and help. But I was able to say, this is what I would love to do in this season. Part of the values were I wanted my family to heal well. I wanted to heal well. And then I wanted to do good church work. But I also knew me running to another senior pastor role would be me escaping the pain. And I would probably transmit my pain on somebody else. And so I wanted to make sense of that.
Why didn't you leave ministry altogether? You're still in ministry, but why didn't you just quit the church, stay a Christian and quit the church?
Because the church didn't do me wrong. 5 people did. Willow didn't hurt me. 5 people did. So deep down, Jesus didn't let me down. God didn't let me down. Holy Spirit didn't let me down. It for me, it's very, very practical. 5 people, 5 good people did evil. A lot of good people got played, and a lot of good people got left holding the bag. This is what happens in crisis. But none of those people were God, Jesus, or the Holy Spirit. Now, 5 of those people represented the church, but for me, I saw it there, and that became my own spiritual process to say, this isn't the institution's fault. Now, there's a lot of institution stuff that we can talk about, deconstruct, reconstruct, but that's, for me, it was really, really basic and practical, and allowed me to actually practice forgiveness, practice my own issues, and practice what I've been preaching, hopefully for the last 20 years, about the gift and how forgiveness truly is a solo sport.
It's helpful to think about that. You know, I did an Instagram poll, highly scientific, but lots of people, I'm joking, 77% of people thought about quitting in the last year, which is crazy to me. And, you know, there's a Barna stat, much cited. I've cited it. 29% of senior pastors seriously thought about quitting without a scandal, crisis, abuse, anything. It's just like leadership is hard. So it's good to know you're teaching at churches, you have a podcast, and let's talk about your book. I love the title, The Thing Beneath the Thing. It's genius. What does that mean?
Yeah. So I had a moment, in probably 2008 or 2008, and I was on the verge of moving from Grand Rapids, Michigan to take a role at Rock Harbor Church in Costa
Mm.
Mesa. And it was kind of crazy weather day, very stormy. And someone, as I was driving back with my wife and 9-month-old, threw a chunk of ice at my car, and it hit our car, and I swerved, and I didn't know that someone had thrown something. Then I started thinking about it as like the cortisol's rushing to my head. I'm like, someone just threw something at us. I pull the car over. I leave my wife and my kids on the side of the road. I see somebody running, and I take off like a crazy person. I call it my moment of madness. And it ends up, you fast forward, like I am freezing cold. I run into a pond. I'm chasing these people through a field into a suburban neighborhood. And it ends up, I knock on the door that I see them run into. And an older gentleman comes, and I'm like, hey, did someone just run into here? I just need to talk to him for a second. And I got soaking wet pants. The guy looks at me and goes, oh, my grandson and his friend did. And door opens up a few minutes later, and it's two junior hires. And I'm having this moment where I feel like God whispers to me, he's like, who's the crazy one now? Like, you left your wife and 9-month-old on the side of the road. You ran. What is going on? And I realized that was the last time I was going to see my grandparents. It was the last time I was going to see my dad for a while, who had leukemia. The buyers who said they were going to buy our house had backed out that night. And all of this was in me, all of this energy, all of this sadness. And a junior hire gave me a place to channel that energy when they threw a chunk of ice. And I called a mentor the next day, and I said, Rob, like, what do I do with this? And he just said, he laughed and he said, hey, welcome to the endless pursuit of getting after the thing beneath the thing, getting after what is really going on. And that just stuck with me. And fast forward a few years, I just always use that phrase because it made me become more emotionally conscious and aware of my feelings. And I realized that thing slowly but surely became this acronym for me to go, gosh, like I have this energy inside me. And if it goes unchecked, it's going to go somewhere. It's going to go somewhere. So that's kind of the heart of the book, is getting after what's really going on and why we do what we do and what to do about it.
I mean, you sent me an early copy and I had the privilege of endorsing it, but like it was laugh out loud funny. It was perceptive. It's theologically sound, a rare combination there. But, my life, like I kind of realized that, right? You get upset in a meeting. You think about how this impacts leadership. Your boss goes crazy on you one day and you're like, what was that about? It wasn't about the report. It wasn't about Sunday service. It wasn't about last month's sales and business. It's like, wow, maybe his wife hates him and, his kids aren't really fond of him right now, or he's got financial problems you don't know about. And it just kind of comes out. There's a thing beneath the thing. And I look at my life, I think I could probably narrate my whole life's about control,
Wow.
and trying to, Enneagram 8, the whole narrative is about control. And how do you unpack that? And why do you hesitate to delegate? And why do you hesitate to, what is that? It's a thing beneath the thing. It's just so helpful for leaders. So you said, for the first time in a long time, I was in touch with my body, my feelings, my sadness, the deeper parts of me. And I absolutely hated it. Can you, that is so, I'm like, yeah, I've been there. Can you explain that moment, that observation, that insight?
Yeah, I think we always have this sense, especially as a preacher and teacher, that Sunday's coming. I often don't want to have to spend time getting after the thing beneath the thing, because I literally know I got to stand up in front of people, and I want to make sure that, I can do that well. And again, it's in capacity of like, I got to be able to have competency at what I do. But truth be told, like if I'm not giving attention to my character, man, it's going to limit my actual ability. It's going to be a lid on it. And what that quote you referenced to kind of came out of, I did a detox, and for a month, my wife and I really tried to eat really, really clean and healthy. And I took away Dr. Pepper, which, that was like a trinity for me, Father, Son, and Dr. Pepper. Like that would give me a lift. I use food as an escape. And I realized that as I started to take things away, I could feel it in my body, these toxins that were there. And I could feel these urges that I had somehow suppressed. And what I began to realize is, oh my goodness, like this is what I'm pumping through my body. This is what I am, whether through just chasing success, whether through food, whether through experience, it is all in me. And now I was becoming aware of what's really driving you, Steve. What's the real motivation? And I think as I got really clear and honest about that, I had to look back and go, oh, I don't like this. I don't like this one bit. And again, if my dream is to finish well, man, there is some stuff that needs to be cleaned up and needs to become more aware and brought to the surface, or it's going to affect every relationship and every potential possibility that God puts before me for me to step into well and honor him, or dishonor me and my family and dishonor him.
Or one or two of those things that you're like, man, I got to clean this up in my 30s, or it's going to be a big issue by the time I get to my 50s.
You know, what's funny is, I a buddy of mine and I were talking, and his mentor told him that the 3 hardest years for most men, most leaders, is 38 through 41. And
you're right there. It's your last 3 years.
Exactly. And so I was like, hey, thanks for telling me this. It was like right when I turned 38. And he goes, no, and he's like, just think about this. And the mentor said, you typically have to wrestle your ego to the ground. Your body's changing. You're realizing you probably aren't where you thought you would be. You're kind of leaning more closely to a specific lane, that this is what your life's going to be. You're going through a level of sadness because of some of that stuff, but also a parent dying. And you're going through like kind of the uniqueness of fathering and mothering in this time. And I just realized, like, oh my goodness, like the level of story work that I had not done. And my dad ends up dying 6 months after I leave Willow. I mean, there was just a level of thing after thing that I could feel the temptation to want to escape, want to numb out, want to just, because I didn't have the muscles to grieve. And so part of that is I just had to recognize my propensity to achieve at all costs. And my wife and I, we've had to process this. I had this one moment with Pete Scazzaro back in the day, and he had come and spoken at this church I was at in Michigan. And I got to drive him from Grand Rapids to Holland. And I had, again, in my Honda Civic, and driving, and he just is asking me questions. And I don't think he liked the answer I gave him. And, if you don't know Pete Scazzaro, he wrote Emotionally Healthy Spirituality. I mean, he's
been a guest. We'll link to him in the show notes. Yeah.
He's a deep, deep thinker. But he told me to pull the car over on the freeway. I'm like, what? And he's like, pull it over right now. And he's from Queens. He's got a great New York accent.
He's got that vibe.
Yeah. And he's like, when did you get married? And I March 6th. And he's like, who did you marry? And I'm like, Sarah. And he goes, that's right. You didn't marry Mars Hill Bible Church. You married Sarah, and he just went after me. And then he gets done after 5 minutes of just kind of pouring into me, but convicting me and challenging me. And then he's like, now you can take me to Holland. And I just remember this moment going, he was right. In my 30s, I had my brides confused. And I didn't have partnership. I had I gotta actually provide for my family. And so this is the best way. So I think part of 30s is, for me, it was wrestling down the ego, wrestling down my just need to achieve, and having to actually really discover what true partnership in a marriage is all about.
Interesting. 38 to 41, for the record, my hardest years for sure. There was the slide into burnout. I burned out when I was 41. And, I feel like that's a hinge in my life. 41 to now is 15 years. The prior 15 years were law school and, the first decade and a half of ministry, whatever. Here's an academic question, maybe a bad one. You've been through a lot over the last 3 years. Let's say the succession plan at Willow had gone as planned. There was no abuse. They're like, don't we wish that had happened, that there was none of that story was true. So let's just say for some reason you ended up, taking over as the original plan was. Do you think your character as it was developed then would have been able to withstand the pressures of ministry from what you know now?
Wow, that's a great question. Here's the one thing I would say is Willow had the resources to provide coaching and to take care and, help out. So I think,
and you can take Willow out of it. Put yourself in any mega church at 38, being the successor, and you're speaking to 20,000 people on a weekend.
Yeah. I want to say I hope so, but
that's a good answer.
I think it's a, one of the things I say every weekend that I'm done teaching, and I'm walking to my car is I'm one weekend closer to finishing well. And it's just, I just broke it down to weekends, just one weekend closer, just one weekend closer. And, I'm 41. If I do this till I'm 65, I got another 24 years, but that's just from a teaching standpoint. If I make it to 82, I'm like halfway there, and so it's like one weekend closer. So I think it's like living in front, having that reality be in front of me. But I'll tell you, man, I don't think anyone felt prepared for 2020. The level of criticism, the level, like everything changed.
The anger, the division, the bitterness online, I
think that would have been really hard for me. It just would have been really hard to me. And I think some of my, more the edges of people pleasing, the edges of trying to not be able to see people, it becoming more digital, the division, having to speak up, what's speaking up enough or not too much, like all of that would have created a lot of stress and gray. But I think it would have been really, really refining in a lot of ways as well. So I hope so, but I think it would have exposed a lot in me.
I think that's a really good answer, man. Like if you ask me, are you going to finish well? It's like, I hope so. So I'm working on it every day. Yeah. I don't know. I don't know that you could ever say, oh yeah, absolutely. Cause boom, there you go.
Yeah.
Or no, I'm a disaster. Well, it's kind of true. Believe in total depravity. I've lived long enough to have some, truth there. Now, these are the deep questions. And one of my heartbeats is I just want to see leaders lead well and I want to see them be well. Do you know what I mean?
Yes.
Forget lead well, just be well.
Yes.
Just be well. And out of being well, you will lead well. And that's why I love conversations like this. Okay, you talk about your book. You talk about hiding. Where do leaders go to hide? How do we hide?
Yeah. So the acronym for the thing beneath the thing is you have triggers, and that's the setup that's going to set you off. So there's that energy. And what I've just come to find out from 20 some years of ministry is that you're typically going to go to a few different places. And the first place that most of us go, we see it in the garden.
Yeah, walk us through the acronym. Just take us through the thing. Yeah.
Yeah. So we often see like when people get triggered, they're going to go somewhere. I mean, I was in a meeting yesterday and somebody said something and I could feel myself getting triggered. And oftentimes we carry that in our bodies and we go home and we look for a hideout. And that hideout is just where we are escaping that moment. And what that moment references, that trigger, is a clue that there is some other pothole or wound that has gone untended to in our story.
So where do you go? Do you go to the fridge? You mentioned food. That's where I will often go.
I typically, food is a big one. Two, oftentimes I'll purchase something. That whole Amazon one click
swipe,
buy,
one click.
Oh, it's just like
another thing I have to.
Yeah, I have to walk away from that. And I think, again, that's just something that I can escape to. Or for me, it's escaping to experience. And and just, I almost need some kind of story that's going to lift me out of this place, instead of just being honest and human to go, hey, why did you get triggered? Get curious, get humble. What's going on there? The second place that I think a lot of us go is to insecurity. And so you get triggered, you go to hideout, the I, you go to insecurity. And insecurity, I think we often think about is playing less than, which is true. We often, I'm so lame. Like we create false stories about ourselves. Like, I should know better. I should be better. Shame, storm just comes over. But also insecurity comes in our envy. And we start to kind of compare my life where I'm at 41 with somebody else who's where they're at 41. And it's a level of comparison. Or you see this happen a ton, is you get triggered and it's a form of insecurity, but it's not powering down. It's literally powering up.
I'll show you. Right?
I gotta show you. I'm going to gain control of this situation. And that's, you see that happen in organizations, which now that I see it, I go, something triggered them. And then the other one is, and we see this on Twitter, we see this, in news, we see this just in real life more than ever, is we get triggered and then we create a false narrative about others. And the N is narrative. And it's those people. It's blue state, it's red state, it's those people, it's everyone who listens to this syndicate, it's and all of a sudden we don't, again, get humble and curious, but the easier thing is to channel all of that toxic energy or that sadness towards those people. And if you ever read like Esther chapter 3, and just read it backwards.
Love Esther.
Oh, it's such a great book. But you read it backwards, chapter 3, the last verse of chapter 3 says, the king and his right-hand man sat down for a drink, and all the people were bewildered. Which makes you wonder, if you're reading it backwards, like in Memento style, go, well, why are they bewildered? And you realize 2 verses earlier, a massive genocide was decreed. And you go, well, why was the genocide decreed? And you start to back it all the way up, and it's because one guy doesn't bow fully to the king's right-hand man, and he gets triggered, and he goes, I'm not just going to kill you, I'm going to kill all your people. And he creates this false narrative. Now, when we get triggered, we're probably not going to try and have a massive genocide happen, but we do this. We villainize. Yeah. We create
Haman
stories.
Is the guy, and he is a fascinating character study. Oh my goodness.
It is. Yeah. And so again, it's just in that. But then I think the greatest leaders that I know, when they get triggered, they see this as an opportunity for grace. And grace is what makes us whole, holy, and spiritually healthy. And John Wesley had 3 stages of grace. And a word that I think has kind of gone out of style for my generation is sanctification, which is the process that makes us whole and holy and spiritually healthy. And so I just go, if we're being triggered, it's usually connected to an older wound. And this is an opportunity that God loves us so much that he wants to keep bringing people into our lives until we honor this pain, this wound, this pothole's truth. And when we're able to invite grace in, man, we become better humans. Like you just talked about, we become well. And when we are well, we're better leaders, we're better followers, we're better husbands and wives and fathers and mothers. We're just better people, better leaders.
Yeah, it was Haman. I'd love to write something on Haman one day, but kind of triggered this thought in me that a life devoted to self, he was all about him, ultimately leaves you alone. Yes. There's just so much irony in that story. And it's so, wow, fascinating. Anything else? So the thing, anything else on the acronym? So that's narrative and...
Yeah, and then G is just grace. And I think grace, gotcha. Yep. And so you've got the triggers, hideouts, insecurity, narratives, grace. And it's an opportunity to help people really become aware of what triggers you, but also become aware of what are those hideouts? What are the stories you tell about yourselves? What are the stories that you tell about others? And then what might God want to do? Last thing I'd say about it is just, when I read that Paul writes, basically, why do I do the things I do? The good I want to do, I do not do. But the stuff I don't want to do, the stuff I hate, I keep doing. And I think every leader, every pastor, every human has had moments where they can feel so connected to the words of Paul. And I think the more that I've gotten curious, the more I realize, oh, I know I did that. The bigger question is, why did I want that? Why did I want that? You do what you want to do. The bigger question is, why? I wanted to fight with my wife so that there'd be a little bit of angst so that I could go buy what I wanted to buy. Let's talk about that. Why did you do what you do? Like getting curious about that. And what are you running from? And if you don't have the courage to actually lean into that, man, it's going to be harder for you to lean in when crisis comes, when struggle comes, when pain comes. And so again, like you so beautifully said it, you can try to run away from you, but you can't hide from you. And the more courage you have to like lean into this, just a better leader, more grace-filled, more healthy and whole person you will. And people are going to want to follow you. People are going to want around you. And that's what my hope and desire is, that as Christ followers, as leaders, as pastors, people can grab hold of this concept and really apply it to their life.
I love this conversation. It sounds like we till the same field these days, Steve. And honestly, I think the questions you're asking, the observations you have, the self-examination you're looking at, in many ways is, moral failure prevention. Do you know what I mean? Because I think you're right. People don't wake up and go, I'm going to completely blow up everyone's life, including some victims and my own and the church. Like people don't, I'm sure it's happened once or twice, but most people, it's subtle. It starts small and the cracks get bigger and the risks get bigger. And it's the unwillingness to ask these questions, to humble yourself, to put yourself under, the microscope, not just you, but other people, and to look at the soul, because in there are the ingredients for life and death, right? Both of that. So point us a little more toward the solution. I think honestly, having the conversation, I remember a Keller sermon where, I forget what he was saying, but it was something like, how do I know? Why do I keep messing up? And how do I know if I'll ever be spiritually mature? And he goes, the fact that you're asking the question is actually a sign of spiritual maturity. So, which is good, rather than look at how mature I am. What are some more thoughts, insights, strategies that can point us toward greater health?
Yeah. My wife and I, we ended up with my in-laws, buying a little cabin up in the mountains, and it had really, really great bones. But just the flooring, drop down ceilings, all of it was just a bit of a train wreck. And so, I'm not very handy. But we just started demoing this place. And what's amazing is they had all of these ceilings in there that blocked the natural light. And as I started to remove these ceilings, and all of a sudden this new light just started to come in. And I realized as I was doing this, I just felt like in my journal time, and God was saying, this is what I want to do in your heart. And it was almost reminded me of Dallas Willard's renovation of the heart. And, he talks about how grace is opposed to earning, but it's never opposed to effort. And I think sometimes for many of us, we think words like the fruit of the Spirit, love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, gentleness, faithfulness, self-control, all of that we're just going to naturally drift towards that. But the truth is, it takes work. Yeah. It takes effort. And again, it might just be the basketball player in me is, for me, I started to have to almost create a vision statement. And Dallas will talk about this, vision, intention, and means. But my vision for the last 6 months is a life anchored in Jesus is one that has nothing to prove, nothing to lose, and nothing to hide. Now, underneath that, the intention to go every day with 35,000 choices coming before me, how am I going to choose that? How am I going to choose to actually live a life where I'm not trying to prove my existence or prove my ability? I'm trying to trust Christ. I'm not trying to live where I'm hiding or losing. No. I have nothing to lose in the kingdom of God. How do I walk in freedom? And it's not just going to happen. I've literally got to create practices, spiritual exercises that are going to help me. And so each month I've just been choosing one new practice to almost learn how to run that vision play of nothing to prove, nothing to lose, nothing to hide. And it's been helpful for me. So again, for me, it's not just knowing theology, but it's the orthopraxy. It's like, how am I now being shaped by these ideas, and how are they getting those 18 inches down from my brain to my heart, down to my hands, to what I see, what comes out of my mouth, how I live my life. So I think for me, in the end of that book, I just try to really give people some real handles and practicals where they can have their own, in Dallas language, renovation of the heart and live a life that's truly anchored in the way of Christ, and watch how God's Spirit makes them more whole, holy, and spiritually healthy.
Can you give us one or two of those practices that have been meaningful to you, Steve?
Yeah. Okay. So I'm such a storyteller, so sorry about this, but we had a buddy of mine we wanted to throw a party for, who was a pastor in his like 60s. So we gathered, had a whole bunch of pastors around him, and we just shared stories. One guy shares this story, and I don't know the guy, but he's really close friends with this pastor that we're honoring. And the guy says that 7 years ago, he and this pastor every morning at 5:50 a.m. would call each other, because this pastor initiated this, and they would call and they would confess their sins to each other from the prior day. They were short with their wife. They weren't present in a meeting. And the first time that this pastor called this guy, he was like, this is the dumbest idea. But the pastor was so like, please, would you do this for me? It will really help me. And they said yes. I think they've missed like 7 days in the course of 7 years. He said it was the most transformational experience. They'd end the call with each person saying to the other, your sins are forgiven. And they would talk not just about the confession, but then what are they going to do differently in the days ahead? And this guy was like, my sin pattern changed. My life changed, but it required me getting up at 5:50 a.m. So my buddy and I were there, and I'm like, I have this statement, nothing to prove, nothing to lose, and nothing to hide. I'm really good at hiding. So I think I got to practice this. And so we did it for 2 months. And I'll tell you, we missed 3 of the mornings because I slept in, but I literally just putting that into practice and learning the art of confession, and hearing a friend of mine say to me, and as a pastor, I'm usually proclaiming this from the stage, your sins are forgiven. Somebody's saying this to me, Steve, your sins are forgiven. Go walk in freedom. It was like, yes. And knowing that I was going to have to say that to somebody, I was like, I don't want to. It made me really question, do I want to actually escape or go hide out here, or think this thought, or power up, or create this narrative? Because if I'm going to have to confess that, no. And so that was one practice. The second one I'll just say is just in solitude. And that was just through hiking, just being silent, being alone, not isolating, but being and having and walking in solitude with God. It was so refreshing, me getting after not trying to prove something, but just being still and present in the presence of God.
Steve, this is resonating so deeply. I'm so grateful. So where can people find you online these days and learn more about you and the book?
Oh, thanks so much. You can go to thethingbeneaththething.com. You can get a free chapter. Also, you can go to stevecarter.org, and then on social media, it's just at Steve Ryan Carter. Steve Ryan Carter.
Steve, you're a gift. Thank you for this conversation, for all the processing, and really, really grateful for you.
Carey, thank you for you. I mean, honestly, I think I speak for so many pastors and so many leaders. One of the greatest parts, and people don't see this behind the scenes, that they get the privilege to learn from you from blogs and books and podcasts. But I don't forget that conversation that we had when I was in the desert, and I just said, hey, I don't think I'm ready to talk about it. And you said, that's great. I'm going to keep checking in. And I just want you to know, like, I love you, and I'm for you, and I'm here. And I've just watched you over the last 4 years, just say what you mean what you say. And you are a gift to a lot of younger leaders like myself. And thanks for being a guy who I know is going to finish well, but a guy who is an example and a role model to so many of us. So blessings to you, and keep doing what you are doing. You are truly a gift, brother.
Thank you, Steve. Thank you so much. Well, I hope today's episode was helpful to you. You can always get more by subscribing to my channel. I also have a lot more content over at CareyNieuwhof.com for leaders in business and leaders in churches. And you can get transcripts of this episode there and so much more, plus some other stuff I do for leaders. So head on over there to discover more at CareyNieuwhof.com. And in the meantime, I really hope our time together today has helped you lead like never before.